The video game industry is failing to preserve its classic games. More and more are disappearing or are in danger of disappearing forever. And had it not been for emulation, they would absolutely be lost forever. Now, I think companies like Xbox have been doing it better. They're trying to bring their classic Xbox and Xbox 360 games into the modern era. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got companies like Nintendo, who recently shut down their 3DS and Wii U store. And many of those games featured on those storefronts were digital only, and they're lost forever. There are 1,000 digital-only 3DS and Wii U games disappearing next week, reads this report from March 22nd, 2023, a week before the shutdown of those respective stores. And here is a breakdown of how many digital-only games were available on Wii U and 3DS that are now gone forever, at least on an official capacity where you can purchase them and access them in some way. And look, I get that video games, porting those over to modern era, it's a little bit more of a complicated process than, say, like movies, which can be preserved because it's strictly a visual medium, not an interactive one. But, we have seen emulation help preserve these video games, but emulation is seen as this vile and obscene thing by game companies who do not really understand their value. Like, don't get me wrong, they have certainly paved the road to piracy, but I feel like the benefits far outweigh the cons, and the way game companies continue to neglect video game preservation is something of a tragedy and a travesty. PlayStation's also not been great on that front. They almost closed down stores for PS3 and PS Vita, but they backpedaled after Backlash. PSP, though, that's done, and a lot of their games just haven't been adapted into the modern era, but they are trying to feature those games via cloud streaming, but that's still not necessarily an ideal solution. But Nintendo is definitely among the big three. I'd say Nintendo is the worst offender, and they have the biggest catalog of games, classic games, that they have to preserve, but so many are currently impossible to access unless you find vintage consoles and vintage cartridges. And especially for Wii U and 3DS games, those digital-only titles have faded into the ether on an official capacity. You have to use unofficial means to be able to access those games. Now, you really get a sense for how dire video game preservation is when you look at this research. So this is Video Games Chronicles article published on July 11th, 2023. The Video Game History Foundation partnered with the Software Preservation Network, and they have found in their research and studies that 87% of classic video games released in the United States are critically endangered. That is a massive number, 87%. Think about that number for a second. That is hundreds, thousands of games we're talking about. And this is a sample of games released prior to 2010. Only a small fraction of them were still in circulation from re-releases. You think about how the film industry has managed to preserve the oldest films and adapted them into, streaming, new digital mediums, as well as, DVDs and Blu-rays and whatnot, and compare that to how video games just completely neglect that history and the importance of that historical preservation, and it's night and day. And it's frankly a shame because there's so many classic games that I'd love to revisit, and I'd love to pay for them too if companies made the effort to just include some kind of emulation or some kind of platform where you can, sign up for a subscription or just pay for these games individually and have those be emulated. And the community has shown, the gaming community, the emulation community has shown that it is very much possible to emulate these games. And with how powerful consoles have become these days, it's certainly more than possible to adapt those games into the modern era. But for some reason, there's just a lack of priority on that front. And, preservation of history is so important. It's how we can look back and look at just the progression of things. And there's so much knowledge and insight there. And also just so many great games that will disappear that, sure, maybe a little dated, but you were maybe set the foundation for things to come or are just unique in their own regard because they were products of their time. And just the thought of that just disappearing and people never getting to experience them on an official capacity and having to jump through hoops in the form of emulation, which companies continue to disapprove of and claim that it's, the bane of gaming and stuff like that. it's just not it's not good optics. The article breaks things down further by highlighting some statistics of specific consoles, classic consoles, and how many of their classic games are currently available and purchasable. So take Commodore 64 games, for example. Only 4.5% of games for this console were still purchasable on a modern digital storefront. And then when it comes to Game Boy family of systems, man, do you remember a Game Boy? Incredible games on there. But among those, only 5.8% are available to be purchased on a modern digital storefront. The preservation job on this has been abysmal, and this number went down this far because of the shutdown of Wii U and 3DS eShop, where it was possible to purchase some of the Game Boy games. Now, Nintendo is trying to bring more games to their Nintendo Online subscription platform, and they've brought some, really great classics on it, but it's only a handful of games that have been handpicked by Nintendo rather than the entire library of games that were available on those platforms. And I know it's complicated because there's like licensing and stuff like that they have to worry about. But there's got to be some kind of common ground that the games industry can reach to do a better job at preserving gaming history, because this feels like they're not even trying. Video Games Chronicles article also highlights this quote from the study that reads, "Imagine if the only way to watch Titanic was to find a used VHS tape and maintain your own vintage equipment so that you could still watch it. Imagine if that was the case for classics like, Star Wars or Blade Runner, you name it, any of those classic vintage movies that still hold up today but have been preserved and even remastered throughout the times to ensure that they live on. The games industry just lagging behind completely. And what if no library, not even the Library of Congress, could do any better? They could keep and digitize that VHS of Titanic, but you'd have to go all the way there to watch it, not readily accessible to the masses, and in turn, it might as well not exist in the eyes of the public. It sounds crazy, but that's the reality we live in with video games, a $180 billion industry, while the games and their history disappear. The games industry has the money, manpower, and resources to be able to make an effort to preserve gaming history. And again, thank God for emulation. The community effort that is stigmatized by game publishers like Nintendo is what's preserved these games. It's what's kept these video games from disappearing into the ether. It's what's helped preserve history. So at the very least, if Nintendo acknowledged that instead of just lambasting emulation as the evil of all gaming, then we could have a conversation. But Nintendo's not made any substantial efforts to preserve their own games. Plenty of other video games from plenty of other long-lost consoles that just unfortunately didn't gain traction, those are getting lost. Emulation and ROMs, the only reason that the existence of those games can be acknowledged, and the only way that these games can even be played at this point. This is just a hard fact, and even then, Nintendo will claim that emulation stifles innovation, which PC Gamer correctly, in my opinion, calls absurd and hypocritical. Scrolling down, they highlight some key points like the hypocrisy of how Nintendo lambasts emulation. I know that at least one contributor to the Android version of Dolphin was involved in Nintendo's official emulation of GameCube and Wii games on the NVIDIA Shield TV. Emulation has paved the road to companies being able to make their own official emulation platforms that will allow games from the past run on newer consoles like the Nintendo Switch. And yet Nintendo will have you believe that community emulation, which paved the road to official emulation, is evil. And then beyond that, this notion that emulation stifles innovation when things like save states, which are applied for, say, re-releases of old games or ports of old games on modern platforms, have been implemented in things like the NES and SNES Classic and the emulation of those games. Things like running games at 2 times the speed for old JRPGs like Final Fantasy VIII, or I was recently playing through Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age on Switch, and that had a speed-up function that was pioneered by emulation, which game companies clearly took ideas from to make these classic games more palatable. So emulation has most definitely paved the road to innovation. And beyond that, emulation has also allowed people to take the games that they own and play them at high resolutions, at higher frame rate, enhance them, mod them, and really make the games that they bought their own. Beyond that, emulation is what has allowed for things like fan translations, that has allowed franchises to gain more of an audience. Games like Miles Edgeworth Investigations 2, which was never released in the US, I remember playing a fan translation of that because I was just such a fan of, and still am a fan of, the Ace Attorney series and the Miles Investigation series. And that was something that just would have not been possible if emulation didn't exist. And that's innovative right there. And we have heard stories surrounding official game development companies and studios hiring fan translators, or just straight up taking fan translations that are available and making them official. The list just goes on and on. For Nintendo and other publishers to characterize emulation as just pure evil and not acknowledge the advantages that it grants, the game preservation that it has allowed, and the just general flexibility and innovation that comes from the community. Many ideas which have been adapted officially by game developers and game publishers proper. It's just a really shitty way of presenting the landscape of emulation, especially when the publisher itself isn't taking efforts to preserve its games and to make them purchasable so that we as customers can officially pay money to acquire these games and be able to play them on modern platforms. Nintendo's trying to wipe off websites that feature emulation and ROM, but in doing so, they're wiping websites that are preserving history and doing more of an effort than Nintendo has ever done. Is on full display with this study right here, where the vast majority of classic video games may very well be gone forever. And keep in mind that, yes, while there are cartridges of some of these games out there, even then, there are only a limited number of copies of those out there, and they become rarer and rarer as some of them become damaged or out of commission, and they will eventually fade away as well. Physical objects have a certain lifespan, and so digital preservation is a priority, especially when so many classic video games are endangered species, if you will. So games industry, you have two options. Either acknowledge emulation and ROMs as a legitimate form of game preservation and acknowledge that emulation has its uses, even if, unfortunately, piracy is a side effect, though I don't think it outshines the pros of ROMs and emulation and games preservation. Or make a better effort to provide a better service so that customers will rely on your official services and storefronts and buy these games to play these classic titles. Make game preservation through unofficial means like emulation and ROMs less relevant by doing a better job officially of preserving your games and making them accessible or purchasable in some way, shape, or form. As Gabe Newell aptly put it, piracy is an issue of service, not price. People will pay for reasonably priced classic games. They just don't know where to get them. People pirate a lot of those classic games because how else are they going to get them? Only hardcore enthusiasts will go out of their way to buy the classic consoles off of eBay or something and then buy the classic games at marked up prices because they're becoming rarer and rarer. It's a hassle to access classic games these days unless you do it through emulation. So game publishers out there, make it not a hassle. Charge, a reasonable price. Make bank. Preserve gaming history. Everybody wins if you make an effort here on this front. Hopefully studies like these and reports like these will make the games industry care a little more and make a better effort at this, because there's a lot to be gained by preserving video games, classic video games, gaming history, and by bringing them into circulation again on digital storefronts or on your platforms. But it's ultimately up to the games industry to decide whether this is a priority for them, and if not, the community will do it through emulation and ROMs, and at that point, you have no excuse to castigate what is now a very useful tool to preserve games. That's all I'm saying. Well, at the very least, that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the current state of video games preservation, the preservation of games history, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.